unspoken fears. Snow moved across the rooftops of Berlin in slow drifts, as though reluctant to touch a city that had forgotten how to breathe. The old Reichstag building, still blackened from the fire months earlier, loomed like a warning no one wished to interpret. Most pretended things were normal. They bought bread, boarded trams, hurried through factory gates, and whispered the new chancellor's name only when walls felt thick enough. Amid this uneasy stillness walked Clara Weiss, a 26-year-old journalist whose notebook was always tucked beneath her coat like a spare lung she could not live without. Her father used to tell her, "Write the truth even when truth walks with a limp." But lately, truth had been crawling. Clara had seen the storm forming long before most. The posters, the rallies, the fists raised like a forest of iron branches. None of it surprised her anymore. What frightened her was the silence growing in ordinary people. Not the silence of reflection, but the silence of surrender. On a dim January afternoon, Clara pushed open the door of Café Morgenrot, a place once filled with philosophers and poets, now half empty, half afraid. The owner, a round man named Herr Wenzel, cleaned glasses as though they carried secrets. "You heard the latest?" he asked softly. "They say new laws are coming, ones that decide who belongs and who doesn't." Clara felt something twist in her chest. They've been deciding that for months. Wenzel gave a nervous glance toward two men in brown uniforms seated near the window. Their armbands glowed red in the dim light, as though pulsing with breath. "Careful," he mouthed. Clara nodded, sat in her usual corner, and opened her notebook. The page trembled slightly, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from her hand. Across town, in a drafty apartment over a tailor shop, Elias Roth, a Jewish violinist of rising reputation, tuned his instrument. His wife, Miriam, folded baby clothes for their daughter Leah, barely 1 year old. The melody Elias practiced, an old lullaby that once hummed comfortably through their home, seemed too gentle for the times. Miriam watched him quietly. She knew the signs too. Posters demanding boycotts, strangers pausing too long outside their door, school children repeating slogans they barely understood. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. Elias looked at her, bow in midair. "And go where? My concerts are here. Our families are here. Surely things will come." But even as he said it, he saw fear flicker across Miriam's face, and the doubt settled on him like dust. Meanwhile, in the gray corridors of the newly fortified government buildings, Karl Brenner, a young bureaucrat fresh from university, walked with papers tucked under his arm and unease under his ribs. He had joined the civil service with naive dreams of rebuilding the nation after chaos and depression. He had believed in order, in stability. But his division now reviewed "citizenship matters," a phrase that had begun to taste bitter in his mouth. This week alone, 3 of his colleagues had vanished into sudden transfers no one explained. A 4th had proudly hung an armband beside his coat. "You should get one too," the man told Karl with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Karl smiled faintly and said nothing, but the future felt heavier each day. Outside the city, the forests were skeletal with winter. The land itself seemed to brace for something unspeakable. And like threads tightening in a loom, lives across Germany began to weave together in ways none of them foresaw. The first test. By March, the Reichstag elections filled the streets with rallies. Clara moved through the crowds like someone mapping a storm from its epicenter. She scribbled everything, chants that rose like walls, fears that sank like stones. Her editor warned her repeatedly, "Avoid trouble, print what is safe, keep your head down." But Clara had long abandoned the idea that safety could be printed into existence. Near Alexanderplatz, she found herself trapped in a surge of cheering supporters as Hitler delivered a speech from a railway platform. His voice carried across the square, sharp and rhythmic, like a conductor demanding an orchestra of thousands to rise and fall at his command. Clara stood motionless, observing faces around her. Some desperate, some fervent, some simply relieved to believe someone could fix their broken world. They didn't see the shadows stretching behind each sentence. A hand suddenly clamped onto her shoulder. She jolted. "You're Clara Weiss, yeah?" The man was tall, brown uniform crisp, eyes scanning her bag. "A reporter?" "Yes." Her voice stayed steady, though her heart hammered. "We've seen your columns. You should be careful with how you portray the chancellor. People misinterpret things." "I report facts," Clara answered. He smiled with an unsettling softness. "Facts can be arranged like furniture. Some arrangements serve the nation better." He released her shoulder and melted back into the crowd, leaving her body colder than the March wind. Across Berlin, Elias prepared for what might be his final concert. Rumors spread that Jewish musicians were being removed from orchestras, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. Invitations disappeared. Letters from patrons turned vague or apologetic. Still, the small hall was filled that night. Friends, students, neighbors unwilling to let music be silenced. As Elias stepped onto the stage, applause broke like a fragile wave. He lifted the violin to his chin. For a moment, everything vanished. Fear, politics, unease. The notes rose pure and bright, carving light through the thickening dark. Miriam held baby Leah against her shoulder, rocking gently, tears slipping down her cheek. Even strangers closed their eyes, letting the music stitch something human back into them. After the final piece, the applause thundered. Elias bowed, unable to speak. Outside the hall, 3 men in brown uniforms stood waiting. They didn't interrupt, they didn't smile. They simply watched Elias exit, eyes following him until he disappeared around a corner. Carl Brenner's conscience began its quiet rebellion in April. One morning, a file landed on his desk regarding Classification Amendment 12B, a bureaucratic name masking a dangerous purpose, determining who was fully German under the new laws. Carl felt ill reading it. Names, birthplaces, grandparents, blood categories. He felt as though he held strangers' lives in his hands, weighed not by actions or merit, but ancestry. His supervisor approached. "Brenner, sign these approvals by day's end." Carl hesitated. "Some of these people, they're citizens like us." "Not anymore," the supervisor replied, voice clipped. "Our job isn't to question, it's to implement." Carl nodded stiffly, but inside something cracked like ice under pressure. That night, he walked home through cold twilight, wishing he could wash his hands free of ink and guilt. Threads began to cross. In late spring, Clara's editor reluctantly assigned her to investigate public reaction to new restrictions on the press. He warned her once again, "No heroics, just write what they want printed." But Clara wasn't built for obedience. Her first stop was a bookshop near the university, or rather, what was left of it. Government officials had raided it days earlier, removing titles they deemed dangerous. Shelves now stared back at her like empty ribs. The owner, a mild man with spectacles too large for his face, whispered, "They say more books will be burned next month. Not just political ones, everything they dislike." Clara stepped outside into the warming air and felt it tighten around her. A country can lose its way, she thought, but when it loses its words, it loses its soul. On her way home, she heard violin music drifting through an open courtyard. It was gentle, mournful. Curious, she followed the sound until she reached a balcony where a slender man played with aching concentration. A woman listened beside him, rocking a child. Clara didn't know them yet, but she would. And the music seemed to thread itself subtly around her, a quiet warning, a quiet invitation. Meanwhile, Carl Brenner attended a mandatory educational seminar for government workers. The hall was filled with banners and new pledges, spoken in unison as though chanting could purify conscience. Carl recited the words, but each syllable felt like sand in his teeth. After the session, his colleague whispered, "You look pale." "I'm fine," Carl lied. But he felt something unfamiliar blooming inside him. Resistance, small as an ember, but alive. The night of echoes. By early summer, Berlin changed its skin entirely. Posters spread over walls like invasive vines. Flags unfurled from windows with mechanical enthusiasm. Students marched with torches, their chants bouncing between buildings. Clara attended one such demonstration, the night that books were burned. The flames rose bright and hungry, swallowing pages, ideas, the quiet with a kind of watchfulness, as though the season itself was uncertain whether it was welcome. People still gathered in cafes, trams still rattled across their routes, and markets still filled with chatter. Yet beneath it all, something pulsed. A new order, invisible but unmistakable, was rearranging the bones of the country. Clara Weiss noticed it first in the eyes of strangers. Conversations died abruptly when a uniform walked past. Shopkeepers spoke in half-sentences. Neighbors who once greeted each other with friendly nods now kept windows shuttered. It felt as though the entire city had been taught to breathe quietly. Clara refused to breathe quietly. On a humid Tuesday, she sat in the newsroom, surrounded by the clatter of typewriters and the smell of ink that never quite left her hair. Her latest article, an investigative piece about the arrests of several university professors, had been returned by the editor with large red lines slicing through paragraphs. "You can't print this," he said, rubbing his temples. "They'll shut us down." "They already control half our pages," Clara answered. "Soon they'll control the other half." The editor leaned closer. "Clara, they asked about you. A man came this morning, brown uniform. He knew your address." Something cold slid down her spine. She closed the folder, tucked it under her arm, and forced a steady breath. "I'll be careful." "You should consider stopping," he whispered, "at least for a while." But Clara knew stopping was its own kind of surrender. Across the city, Elias Roth stood outside the Jewish Cultural Society office, reading a newly posted notice. It wasn't long, just a few clipped lines stating that certain public spaces were now restricted. Concert halls, universities, city auditoriums. His name, once printed on posters across Germany, now felt like contraband he carried in his own chest. A man beside him muttered, "They want us invisible." Elias didn't answer. He had no words that could hold the growing weight in his stomach. When he returned home, Miriam greeted him with a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You saw the notice?" she asked. He nodded. "Elias, I wrote to my cousin in Amsterdam. She says we can stay with her for a while." He leaned against the table, feeling it steady him. "Leaving is admitting defeat." "No," she said softly, placing a hand on his. "Leaving is staying alive." Baby Leah crawled under the table, giggling as though the world still made sense. Elias knelt and lifted her into his arms. Her tiny hand rested against his cheek, warm and certain. He whispered, "I just want her to grow up in a place that doesn't teach her to fear her own name." At the ministry building, Carl Brenner found a file on his desk heavier than any he'd handled before. His supervisor stood nearby, tapping a pen against his palm. "This is a priority classification," the supervisor said. "Two citizens under review, Elias and Miriam Roth. Musician, his wife. Their status is questionable." Carl felt a pressure behind his ribs. "They were born here," he said carefully. "That isn't the question anymore." Samuel Langer, the new deputy, approached. His uniform was spotless, his expression carved from stone. "Brenner, we're streamlining the system," Langer said. "No delays, no debates. Process the documentation. Efficiency is strength." Carl nodded, the gesture mechanical. When they left, he sat with the file open before him, staring at the names as though they were calling for help. Elias Roth, violinist. Wife, Miriam. Child, Leah. Status, pending review. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the paper until it hurt. I could slow this process, he thought. One missing signature, one delayed stamp. But such acts were dangerous. The ministry had begun auditing desks, searching for suspicious negligence. Even hesitation had become a political crime. Still, the idea rooted itself inside him, small, stubborn, impossible to ignore. A meeting in the unlikely hour. A week later, Clara attended a midnight gathering in a dim apartment above a bakery. Dissidents, intellectuals, students, people who still believed the truth deserved breath. They met quietly, like a pulse beneath the city. Tonight, someone new had been invited. Carl Brenner. He arrived late, his coat damp from the evening storm. The others eyed him with a blend of curiosity and caution. Government employees weren't usually welcomed. Clara noticed him first. "You look lost," she said. Carl swallowed. "I suppose I am." "What brought you here?" He hesitated. Then, paperwork. Paperwork. He gave a thin, weary smile. "I process classifications, names, families, citizens, and lately, I've been helping build a cage without meaning to." Clara studied him, pen resting against her lip. The room quieted. Carl continued, voice low. "I can't undo the laws, but maybe I can slow them, redirect them, help certain files disappear." The room murmured cautiously. One student asked, "Why risk your life?" Carl's eyes dropped. "Because someday, when this is over, I'd like to recognize the man I see in the mirror." Clara nodded slowly. "Then you're in the right room." For the first time in months, he felt the faintest pulse of hope. Pressure tightens. Summer rolled into autumn with a kind of cold that felt premature, as though the season itself wished to warn everyone. New decrees came weekly. Travel restrictions, registry mandates, curfews that began as suggestions and ended as laws. Elias's final concerts were canceled. His students were dismissed from their conservatories. Even the narrow street he lived on seemed to shrink, neighbors avoiding eye contact as though fear might be contagious. One evening, returning from a failed attempt to apply for travel papers, Elias found a letter slid under his door. Notification of property review. Date immediate. Miriam's breath hitched as she read it. "They're coming for the house." "They're coming for everything," Elias whispered. They both knew what needed to be done. "We leave," Miriam said. "Now. We pack tonight." But trains required papers, borders required luck, and time was something they no longer had. Carl's internal resistance grew sharper. He fabricated delays, misfiled certain documents. A few of the worst cases vanished from the system entirely, like quiet acts of mercy. But then came the moment he feared. Deputy Langer summoned him. "You've been working slowly," Langer said. "Too slowly." Carl felt heat crawl up his neck. "The backlog?" "There is no backlog," interrupted Langer. "Only inefficiency." He placed a file on the desk. Carl froze. It was the Roth family's file. "This case is to be finalized today," Langer said. "No exceptions." Carl's heartbeat roared. "Yes, sir." When Langer left, he stared at the file, the names, the ink that could doom a family with one stroke. He closed the folder and made his decision. Paths intersect. Late that night, Clara was walking home from the newsroom when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She spun, heart jolting, ready to run. "Carl," she said. He stood in the lamplight, face pale, breath uneven. "I need your help," he said. "With what?" He handed her the file. She opened it slowly. "The Roth family." "They're going to lose everything," Carl said. "Possibly be detained. I can stall only so long." Clara closed the folder with a decisive snap. "Where are they now?" "I don't know. But if we don't act tonight, the decision becomes permanent." Clara didn't hesitate. "Then we find them." The city around them was quiet, like a held breath. Clara found Elias through a musician friend who whispered his address like a secret. When she arrived at his apartment, she knocked urgently. Elias opened the door, eyes weary with sleeplessness. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. Miriam stepped closer, clutching Leah tightly. "Danger?" Clara handed them the file. Elias read it with trembling hands. Miriam steadied him. "Who gave you this?" he whispered. "A man trying to do something right for once," Clara said. "You need to leave. Tonight, if possible." Miriam looked around their small home, at the violin resting on a chair, at the photographs pinned to the wall. "Where would we go?" "As far as you can until dawn," Clara answered. "Carl can help you get a temporary transit pass. It's not much, but it might buy you hours." Elias looked at Miriam, and little Leah crawled through the outskirts of Berlin like a wounded creature trying to escape a trap. Inside the dim carriage, passengers sat with the quiet stiffness of people who no longer trusted the future. Lantern light flickered over wary faces, workers, travelers, a few soldiers, and a handful of families pretending that travel was still a normal act rather than an act of defiance. Elias kept one arm around Miriam, the other protectively near the violin case resting at his feet. The polished wood glimmered faintly, a reminder of who he had been and perhaps who he still was. Miriam whispered, "Will we make the border?" He didn't answer immediately. The rhythm of the train felt like a heartbeat that wasn't sure it wanted to continue. "We'll try," Elias finally said. "Trying is all we have." Leah slept curled against her mother's shoulder, her small breath rising and falling, one of the few sounds that still carried innocence. The conductor passed through the carriage, his boots thudding softly. "Checkpoint in 20 minutes," he called. "Have documentation ready." Elias felt his stomach knot. The temporary transit pass Carl had prepared was clever but fragile, like a thread pulled taut. One aggressive question could snap it. Miriam squeezed his hand. "We trust the people who helped us. That must be enough." Elias nodded, though the fear crawled beneath his skin like cold air. Back in Berlin, Clara returned home just before dawn, the sky smudged with early soot-colored light. Her small apartment had become more of a refuge than a home, its corners filled with stacks of notes, drafts, and unanswered questions. She hung her coat, filled the kettle, and sat by the window overlooking the silent street. Sleep felt distant, as though it had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Carl's decision to intervene had shaken her, partly because it was dangerous, partly because it was proof that even inside the machine, some gears refused to turn. She opened her notebook and wrote a line. "A country does not collapse all at once. It collapses in the quiet decisions of ordinary people." Clara let the sentence linger before continuing. The world outside was shifting, tightening, transforming into something unrecognizable. And yet, human courage still flickered in small acts. Carl saving the file. Elias stepping onto the train. Miriam choosing hope over fear. These were the fragile lights she clung to. There was a knock at the door. Clara stiffened. Too early for visitors, too quiet for safety. She approached cautiously, hand hovering near the doorknob. "Who is it?" she asked. "It's me," Carl's voice almost whispering. She opened the door. Carl stood there, pale and exhausted, rain clinging to his coat like second skin. His eyes held the look of someone who had crossed an invisible boundary within himself. "They know," he said. Clara's breath tightened. About the file? Not yet. But they're asking questions about my delays, about why certain names aren't appearing in the system. He stepped inside. Clara closed the door behind him. Carl sank into a chair. Langer is suspicious. He doesn't accuse, he just watches, and his watching feels like a verdict waiting for breath. You did the right thing, Clara said. The right thing is sometimes a slow form of suicide, Carl murmured. But I couldn't let that family vanish into paperwork. Clara sat across from him. They're on the train now. They have a chance. That's because of you. Something tightened in his expression. Pain mingled with relief, like a man standing ankle-deep in rising water who still sees the sky. What happens next? He asked quietly. Clara folded her hands. We keep going. The checkpoint. The train slowed, shuddering as it approached the border inspection station. Soldiers moved along the platform, lanterns swinging like restless stars. Elias's pulse hammered. Miriam held Leah closer. The child stirred, then fell asleep again. A uniformed officer entered the carriage, his face impassive. He moved row by row, checking documents with mechanical precision. Every click of his boots felt like a countdown. Elias handed over the transit pass, trying to keep his hand steady. The officer studied it. His brow creased. Purpose of travel? He asked. I'm a musician, Elias replied. Family trip, short visit. The officer scanned the document again. Something in his expression shifted. Interest, suspicion, irritation? Elias couldn't tell. Finally, the officer nodded. Proceed. Elias felt his lungs fill for the first time in minutes. But then, wait. The officer had spotted the violin case. Elias froze. Miriam's breath caught. It's just my instrument, Elias said quietly. Open it, the officer repeated. Elias knelt, hands trembling, and clicked open the latches. The wood glimmered softly, almost vulnerable. The officer examined it, fingers grazing the strings. You're traveling with a valuable instrument during unstable times, he said. His tone hinted at an unspoken suggestion. A bribe. Elias swallowed. It's precious to me. The officer's eyes narrowed. Miriam reached into her coat and pulled out a small purse, one she had hidden away for emergencies. She offered it subtly. The officer took it as though accepting a mundane item. Then he nodded, stepping back. Proceed. The family exhaled in painful relief as the officer moved on. The train lurched forward, carrying them deeper into uncertain hope. A quiet rebellion within the ministry. Back in Berlin, Carl arrived at the ministry building to find an unusual stillness in the hallways. People walked more rigidly. Doors were shut. Conversations were hushed. When he reached his desk, a white envelope lay atop his files. For a moment, he felt his heart slip. He opened it. For Deputy Langer's office at noon. That was all. Carl sat slowly, the air thick around him. He felt like a man stepping onto cracked ice. Hours passed in heavy silence. When noon came, he walked to Langer's office, each step deliberate. The door was ajar. Langer stood inside, hands clasped behind him, face unreadable. Brenner, Langer said, sit. Carl obeyed. There have been irregularities in your recent work, Langer continued. Delays, missing documents, discrepancies. Carl pulled around him slowly, like a man examining the shape of a shadow. Errors, Langer repeated. Yet all these errors benefit certain people. Carl's heartbeat roared. I don't choose who benefits, Carl said. Paperwork is simply paperwork. Langer paused behind him. Careful, Brenner. Paperwork is never simply paperwork anymore. Carl felt sweat at his temple. After a long silence, Langer spoke again. You're intelligent. You know the country is changing. Those who adapt will thrive. Those who resist, well, they don't tend to stay long. Carl nodded slightly. I understand. Good, Langer said. See that you do. He dismissed him with a flick of the hand. Outside, Carl exhaled shakily, the world tilting beneath his feet. He had been warned, but not caught. Not yet. The borders shimmer. Elias and his family reached the final checkpoint near the Dutch border. Soldiers lined the station, their breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. This time, the officers examined everyone slowly. A dog barked sharply. A woman cried quietly. Miriam gripped Elias's hand until her knuckles whitened. An officer approached them, tall and rigid. "Papers?" he asked. Elias handed them over. The officer read them carefully. Then again. "Step aside," he ordered. Miriam felt her knees weakened. "Is something wrong?" "Wait." The officer turned and spoke to another guard in low tones. Elias felt panic surge. Had Langer discovered the missing file? Had their names already been flagged? The officer returned. He lowered his voice slightly. "You're clear to proceed." Miriam nearly collapsed in relief. Elias whispered, "Thank you." The officer's gaze flickered. For a fraction of a second, there was something human in his eyes, something conflicted. Then it vanished. "Board the next train," he ordered. Elias didn't question it. Minutes later, the three of them stepped across the invisible line that separated Germany from the uncertain safety beyond its borders. They had escaped, for now. The city's quiet collapse. Back in Berlin, Clara walked through neighborhoods once vibrant with debate, poetry, music. Now posters covered the walls like warning signs. Uniforms patrolled with growing frequency. People carried fear like an extra layer of clothing. Yet under it all, small acts of resistance flickered. A coded message slipped under Clara's door. A forbidden pamphlet passed hand to hand. A whisper from a friend, "We will not all bend." She met Carl again that evening. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the weight of his choices. The train from Munich groaned like an old animal as it dragged itself northward through the night. Inside, the wooden compartment smelled of coal dust and damp wool, and the dim yellow lights flickered as if unsure whether they should keep the passengers company or surrender to the darkness. Emil Keller sat rigidly by the window, his gloved hands locking and unlocking around a small leather notebook. The rhythmic thumping of the wheels on the tracks did nothing to comfort him. Every mile carried him closer to Berlin and deeper into the fragile web of danger woven beneath the Nazi state. Across from him sat a woman in her mid-20s, wrapped in a navy blue coat. Her hair was hidden beneath a scarf, and her posture was straight, composed. Emil recognized her because he had been told to. Clara Weiss, school teacher, daughter of a decorated World War I officer, and, quietly, a courier for the Red Orchestra, one of the boldest resistance groups operating within Germany. She pretended not to know him, staring at a small newspaper folded on her lap. But every few minutes, her eyes lifted to the window's reflection, checking the aisle. "You're late leaving Munich," she said softly, without looking at him. "The police were searching the station again," Emil replied. "More arrests." Clara exhaled. "It's becoming routine. They're tightening the net." "They're terrified of invisible enemies," he said. "Good," her voice hardened, "because invisible enemies are exactly what we intend to be." A gust of cold seeped through the gaps in the window frame, brushing around them like an unseen warning. Emil leaned closer. "Did you bring it?" he whispered. Clara slid her gloved finger into the spine of the newspaper and produced a small envelope, one so thin it could be mistaken for a receipt. She kept it hidden beneath the table between them. "This contains the radio frequency the group will use next month," she murmured. "If the Gestapo intercepts even one message, it's over. You must memorize it tonight. Burn it before morning." He nodded. But burning paper wasn't the dangerous part. Carrying truth through a country built on lies, that was the real fire. Berlin. By the time they reached Berlin's Anhalter Bahnhof, dawn was a pale bruise along the horizon. The station was echoing with boots, soldiers, police, laborers marching to factories. Posters of Hitler smiled down with the same frozen grin plastered on every wall. Clara stepped off the train first, blending into the river of commuters. Emil followed a few steps behind, careful not to acknowledge her. They had rehearsed this. They were shadows, even in their own story. As he reached the exit, a sharp whistle cut through the air. "You there!" Emil felt his chest contract. A uniformed officer began walking toward him. He turned slowly. The officer pointed to Emil's briefcase. "Open it." People streamed around them, pretending not to notice, as if fear were a contagion they hoped to avoid breathing in. Emil's fingers shook as he unlatched the case. Inside were harmless academic papers and a few books, authentic enough to pass inspection. The officer flicked through them lazily. "What brings you to Berlin?" he demanded. "University conference," Emil answered. "Lectures on European political transitions." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Transitions? We are not transitioning, we are rising." "Yes," Emil murmured, "that is exactly what I intend to discuss." The officer closed the briefcase. For a breathless moment, he stared into Emil's eyes, searching for something. Fear, defiance, unfamiliar shadows. Then he stepped aside. "Go." Emil walked out into the cold, his pulse pounding against his ribs like fists on a locked door. He didn't know the officer had followed him with his eyes long after he disappeared into the crowd. Clara's classroom. Clara spent her mornings teaching children who would one day become the regime's soldiers, clerks, and cogs. Today, they practiced handwriting under posters urging loyalty to Führer and fatherland. A boy raised his hand timidly. "Fräulein Weiss," he asked, "is it true that enemies are everywhere?" She paused. "They want you to believe that," she said quietly. "But is it true?" She leaned closer, her voice softer but steady. "Listen carefully. Sometimes people who are afraid see enemies everywhere. It doesn't mean they're really there." The boy nodded, though confusion still clouded his young face. As she straightened, she noticed a man near the doorway. Sharp jaw, black coat, eyes like polished metal. He stood just enough for her to feel his presence, then stepped away. Clara's breath caught. That was no parent, no inspector, no wandering official. Gestapo. The word felt like a cold hand pressed against her spine. She forced herself to keep teaching as if nothing were wrong. It was the only way to survive. The storm gathers. That night, in a narrow apartment above an abandoned hat shop, Emil and Clara met with two others from the resistance, a printer named Vogel and a former nurse named Margaret. Maps lay scattered across the table. Radio codes, lists of Jewish families marked for deportation, names of officers secretly aiding them. "New law goes into effect next week," Margaret said grimly. "Mixed marriages dissolved by force." Vogel slammed his fist on the table. Another home destroyed, another family wiped from the records. "Our task is bigger now," Clara said, "not just gathering information, saving whoever we can." Emil hesitated, then pulled out the envelope. "This frequency will keep our communications alive for another month. After that, we find another way." Vogel leaned back, exhausted etched into the lines of his face. "Sometimes I wonder how long until they catch us." Emil's voice was low but unwavering. "Until they do, we fight." Outside, the streets of Berlin hummed with marching boots and broadcast speeches. But inside this cramped room, 4 ordinary people carried a different sound, the fragile, stubborn rhythm of defiance. And though the city belonged to the regime, the night belonged to them.